My name is Lorraine. I was 39 years old when my brother called to tell me our mother had changed her will, and I remember exactly where I was standing when the phone rang. Because I had just signed the papers on a house I had spent 11 years saving for, and the pen was still in my hand. That detail, I keep coming back to it, the pen still warm from my fingers, the ink barely dry on the best thing I had ever done for myself. And then his voice on the other end of the line. Careful in that particular way voices get when the person speaking has already decided they are delivering news and not having a conversation. "Mom changed the will," he said. "I thought you should know." I didn't ask why, I already knew why. The why had been building for 31 years, patient as weather, and I had spent most of those years telling myself I was imagining it. I wasn't imagining it. But before I tell you what was in that will, and I'll get there, I promise, I need to tell you about a house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a woman named Gloria Moe. And what it means to grow up in a family where the love is real, but the distribution of it is so uneven that you spend your whole childhood trying to figure out what you did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. That took me a long time to understand. A long time and a lot of miles, and a specific Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office where the whole thing finally landed right. But we're not there yet. Before I go any further, I want to stop and ask you something. Where are you right now? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Maybe it's late, and the house has finally settled around you. Or maybe you found a few minutes of stillness in the middle of a day that hasn't given you many. I think about you, whoever you are, wherever you are, more than you might expect. Have you ever loved someone who made you feel, without ever saying it out loud, that you were slightly less than? Not unloved, just less than. Less bright, less worthy, less the person the room lit up for. Have you carried that and called it something else for years because naming it felt like a betrayal? I carried it for 3 decades. This is what I did with it. If this channel has ever made you feel like your story matters, please subscribe and leave something in the comments. Even just where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I mean that. Okay, Baton Rouge, 1978. I was born second. That's the whole origin story. Really, I was born second in a family where being born first meant something permanent, and being born second meant you spent the rest of your life negotiating the fact that someone else had already claimed the territory. My brother Raymond was 4 years older than me. He was, and I want to be careful here, because Raymond is complicated in the way that all people who have hurt you badly, while also not being entirely bad, are complicated. He was one of those children that families organize themselves around without deciding to. Loud in a warm way, funny in a way that made adults feel included. The kind of boy who walked into a room and made the room feel like something was finally happening. I was not that child. I was quiet, I read, I noticed things. I had my father's dark eyes and my grandmother's habit of watching people from a slight distance before deciding what I thought of them, which adults found unsettling in a child, and which I later understood was just a particular kind of intelligence looking for a safe place to land. My mother, Gloria, small woman, enormous personality, the kind of presence that fills a room without raising her voice, loved us both. I believe that completely. I have never doubted that she loved me. What I doubted, for most of my childhood, was whether she liked me, whether she found me as easy to love as she found Raymond. Whether the love she had for me required something from her that the love she had for him did not. The first time I understood there was a difference, I was 8. Raymond was 12, which meant he was in the phase of being 12 years old and my mother's son, that involved a great deal of eye contact between them at the dinner table, and a great deal of laughter at things I wasn't quite in on, and a general quality of ease that I watched from my seat across from him, the way you watch a fire, warm if you're close enough. But the warmth is not directed at you specifically. It's just what fire does. My father, Thomas, who worked at a paper mill and smelled like pine resin and had the most patient temperament of any human being I have ever known, was the one who saw me. He was not loud about it. He just had a way of turning toward me in rooms, of asking what I was reading, of appearing in the kitchen when I was doing homework and sitting down across from me with his coffee and just being there. present without agenda. He died when I was 9. Heart attack, February, a Wednesday before breakfast. He was 41. I don't talk about losing my father very often because I don't have the words for it that feel adequate. And I have found over the years that the inadequate words do a kind of violence to the real thing. So I'll just say, he was the person in my family who saw me clearly and without condition, and he was gone before I was old enough to understand what I was losing. And his absence is a thing I have carried every day since, in a way that is now so familiar, it is almost indistinguishable from breathing. My mother grieved in the way strong women sometimes grieve, by becoming more of herself, harder and faster and more certain. She went back to work full-time within a month. She managed everything. She never broke down in front of us, which I understood later was a kind of protection and a kind of damage simultaneously. And she leaned into Raymond. I understand it now. He was 13, the man of the house in the way that phrase gets used to put too much weight on boys too young to carry it. She needed someone to talk to, someone to consult, someone who felt like a partner in the enormous task of keeping everything going. Raymond was there. Raymond was ready. I was 10. I was too young, too quiet, too much my father's child in all the ways that were probably hard to look at in the year after my father died. So the leaning happened, and it kept happening. And by the time I was 12 and Raymond was 16, and things had settled into the new shape of our family, the lean had become structural. Raymond was the one she called first. Raymond was the one whose opinion she asked. Raymond was the one whose choices she funded and supported and celebrated with a fullness that my choices, equally considered, equally important to me, simply didn't receive. The birthday I think about most is my 16th. Raymond's 16th, 4 years before mine, had been a party. 40 people in the backyard, a caterer, a cake from the good bakery downtown that my mother drove 40 minutes to get because Raymond had mentioned once that he liked their lemon filling. Music. A card from my mother with a long handwritten letter, inside that I had not read but had seen the length of it. Had watched Raymond fold it carefully and put it in his back pocket like something worth keeping. My 16th was a dinner. My mother and Raymond and me at a restaurant I liked that was not the nicest restaurant in Baton Rouge. My mother gave me a card with $60 in it and a printed sentiment she had not written herself. She paid for dinner. She drove me home. That was it. I didn't say anything. I had learned, by 16, that saying anything in the register of "this isn't equal" produced one of two responses from my mother. Genuine confusion, as though she could not see what I was seeing. Or a mild irritation, as though I had introduced an unpleasantness that hadn't been there before I named it. Neither response gave me anything useful, so I stopped naming it. I got good at other things instead. I was good at school in the specific way that children who are looking for a place to be seen often get good at school, not to please anyone. But because it was somewhere the rules were clear, and the results were measurable, and nobody's favor was required. I finished high school with a 3.9 GPA and got into LSU on a partial academic scholarship. I told my mother 2 weeks after acceptance, matter-of-factly, the way I'd learned to present my own achievements. Low-key, no fanfare, preemptively flattened so there was nothing to deflate. She said she was proud of me. I believe she meant it. She had paid for 2 years of Raymond's college before he dropped out to start a landscaping business. She did not offer to pay for any of mine. I did not ask. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make my mother into something she wasn't. She was a woman shaped by the particular pressures of widowhood and single parenthood, and a generation that taught women to pour themselves into their children and didn't equip them to pour equally. She had a favorite. She probably didn't know she had a favorite. That's almost worse than knowing, in certain ways. The unconscious preference is harder to argue with, harder to appeal, harder to make visible to the person doing it. I moved out the week after high school graduation. I was 18. I had $2,200 in savings, money I had made waitressing since I was 15, and an address for a room in a house near the LSU campus that I was splitting with 2 other girls. I packed my car in the morning while my mother was at work because I knew a full departure scene would be painful in ways I wasn't up to managing. I left a note on the kitchen table. Short. I love you, I'll call. I called every Sunday. I kept the calls short. Stay with me because I know that was a lot of ground to cover and I've moved quickly through it. I moved quickly because those years, the childhood years, the being-shaped years, they're important for understanding everything that comes after, but they're not the center. The center comes later. The center involves a will and a piece of land, and a phone call on the best day of my life, and what I decided to do about all of it. But you need the ground under your feet before you can understand the house. LSU was 4 years of genuine work and genuine discovery, and for the first time in my memory, genuine belonging. I studied accounting. I know that sounds dry. It wasn't dry to me. It was numbers telling the truth about things, and I had always trusted numbers more than words because numbers didn't have unconscious preferences. I was good at it with a sureness that I hadn't felt about myself in any other context, and that sureness was so new that I handled it carefully, the way you handle something you're afraid of dropping. I had 2 close friends, a woman named Bet who was studying nursing and who had a laugh that could be heard from the adjacent building and who taught me, through sheer force of example, that taking up space was not the same as being a burden. And a woman named Nora, who was in my accounting cohort and who was quietly formidable in all the ways I was learning to be and who, 20 years later, is still one of the people I call when something matters. I graduated at 22. Got a job immediately with a regional accounting firm in New Orleans, a 2-hour drive from Baton Rouge, which felt like the right amount of distance. I was good at the job. I was promoted in 18 months. I made CPA at 25, which was faster than average for the firm, and my supervising partner, a precise, unhurried man named Robert Goddett, who had been doing this for 30 years and had very little patience for anything other than excellent work, shook my hand on the day the certification came through and said, "You've got a future here, Lorraine. Don't waste it." I didn't waste it. I want to tell you about the years honestly, the way they actually were, without compressing them into a montage of success. They were hard. The first apartment in New Orleans was a second-floor walk-up in mid-city, with a bathroom that flooded when it rained heavily, and a neighbor who played music until 2 a.m. on weekdays. I ate a lot of pasta. I worked a lot of hours. I sent my mother a birthday card every year and called on holidays and drove to Baton Rouge for Christmas and sat at the table that had always had the same configuration, Raymond across from me. My mother at the head, the lean still structural even now that we were adults, and ate my mother's red beans and went home. Raymond's landscaping business had done reasonably well. He had 6 employees by the time I was 25, a fleet of trucks, accounts with 3 commercial properties, and a growing residential client list. My mother talked about Raymond's business the way she talked about very few things, with a particular animation, a pride that sat right on the surface of her. She knew the names of his employees. She knew the names of his clients. She had at one point lent him $18,000 to cover a cash flow gap during a slow winter. She had never lent me anything. I had never asked. I'm not going to tell you I felt nothing about this. I felt something about this for years. A low-grade something, not quite anger. More like the persistent awareness of a discrepancy that I had decided not to spend my life focused on, because focusing on it would cost me something I couldn't afford to spend. I put it somewhere interior. I kept building. The New Orleans years, 22 to 33, were the years I became who I am, not in a dramatic sense. In the incremental, mostly unglamorous sense, that real becoming usually happens. I changed firms at 28, moving to a smaller boutique firm that specialized in small business and estate work, which suited both my skills and my temperament. I bought my first car outright at 30. I started putting 15% of every paycheck into savings from the day I started working, a habit I'd developed reading a personal finance book I'd found at a used bookstore at 23, and which was, in retrospect, the single most consequential decision I made in my 20s. At 33, I moved back to the Baton Rouge area. Not to the city, to a town about 20 miles out, smaller and quieter, where I'd found a position with a regional firm that was better suited to what I'd built, and offered a partnership track that New Orleans hadn't. I rented a small house with a yard and planted tomatoes in the back, which died, and then planted them again the following year, which also died, and the year after that, stubbornly. Planted them again. Third year they grew. I keep that in my head when things are hard. Third year they grew. The partnership track took 4 years. I made partner at 37. The announcement came on a Thursday in March. I was sitting at my desk when the managing partner, a woman named Frances Dubois, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the most unflappable demeanor of anyone I had worked for, appeared in my doorway and said, "Come to the conference room." "Lorraine, we have some news." I called my mother that evening. She said she was happy for me. She said Raymond had just hired his 7th employee. I held the phone for a moment and then said, "That's great, Mom. Tell him congratulations from me." And I meant it. I genuinely did. That's the thing about getting to a certain point in your own life. You stop needing other people's achievements to be smaller in order for yours to feel real. Which brings me to the house. The house was in a neighborhood I had been watching for 2 years. Not an expensive neighborhood, comfortable, established, the kind of tree-lined street where people stay for decades and know each other's names. A 3-bedroom craftsman with original hardwood floors and a porch that faced west and got the evening light, and a yard that I had decided, without question, was going to have a proper garden. With beds, with actual planning, nothing that would die. I had been saving for it for 11 years. 11 years of the 15% plus extra, plus the partnership income, plus 6 years of essentially no debt. The down payment was $67,000. I paid it in cash. Transferred from the account I had been adding to since I was 26 with the specific discipline of someone who had decided that ownership was going to be the physical proof of everything she had. Built in the years nobody was watching. I signed the papers on a Friday afternoon. The pen was still in my hand when Raymond called. "Mom changed the will," he said. I set the pen down on the table. The escrow officer was still in the room, a young woman who had the sensitivity to suddenly become very interested in organizing the paperwork to her right. "When?" I asked. "Last month." "She told me last night. I thought you should hear it from me." I thought you should hear it from me, the phrasing of that, as though he were doing me a courtesy. As though delivering bad news gently was the same as not participating in the bad news. "Tell me," I said. He told me. My mother's estate included the house in Baton Rouge, the house I'd grown up in, which had been in my mother's family for 2 generations, and which I had assumed, without it ever being explicitly stated, would be divided equally between Raymond and me. It also included a piece of land outside the city, 8 acres that her own mother had left her, raw land, undeveloped, that had been appraised recently and had come in at $340,000. The original will, the one that had existed for as long as I knew there was a will, split everything equally. House and land, 50-50. The new will gave Raymond the land outright. All 8 acres. The house was still split equally, but the land, the most valuable single asset in the estate, was his. I don't know what I expected to feel. I had thought in some back part of my mind that this conversation was possible, that the will could be changed, that the favor could be formalized into document. I had thought about it the way you think about car accidents, aware that they happen, just not expecting to be in one today. "Did she say why?" I asked. A pause. "She said it was because of the business. She wanted to help secure the business's future." "His business," I said. "Lorraine, I understand," I said. "Thank you for telling me." I drove home from the escrow office in the direction of my new house, my house. Bought with 11 years of methodical saving and zero assistance, and a discipline that had cost me things I won't fully inventory because the inventory would take too long, and I pulled into the driveway and sat there with the engine off. The porch faced west. The evening light was doing exactly what I had hoped it would do. I sat there for a long time. I want to tell you what I didn't do. I didn't call my mother that night. I didn't call Raymond back. I didn't call Nora, though Nora would have been the right call and I knew it. I just sat with it. In the driveway of the house I had bought myself, with the light going orange on the porch, with the full weight of it settling into the place where these things settle. I made dinner. I ate it alone. I did the dishes just to have something to do with my hands, and then I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard that was going to have a proper garden, beds, planning. Nothing dying, and I thought about my father. I thought about him specifically, about his hands, which I remember as large and calloused from the mill, about the way he sat across from me at the kitchen table with his coffee and just was there, about what he would have said about this, about the will, about what my mother had decided. I think he would have been sad, not angry. Sad in the particular way of people who love someone who keeps making the same mistake. I called my mother on Sunday. I kept the call short. I did not bring up the will. She didn't bring it up either. That silence, her not bringing it up, told me more than any conversation could have. She knew what she had done. She had made the decision and filed the paperwork and said nothing to me and was now waiting, I think, to see if I would make it a problem. I did not make it a problem. Not then. Have you ever had to decide between saying the true thing immediately and waiting until you had all the information you needed to say it effectively? That's where I was. The true thing was available. I could have driven to Baton Rouge that weekend and sat down at the table and said, I know, and I need to understand, and I need you to look at what you've done. But the effective thing required more. It required me to understand the full picture first, the full legal picture. I am an accountant. I do estate work. I understood the full legal picture better than most people in my position would have. And what I understood was this: the will could be changed again. My mother was 71 and in reasonable health but not perfect health. She had high blood pressure and a knee that needed replacing and a stubbornness about both that was characteristic. She could live another 20 years. She could change the will 3 more times. She was within her rights to do any of it. What I also understood, and this is the part I had to sit with carefully, the part that required me to be honest with myself about what I was doing and why, was that my goal was not to punish anyone. My goal was not to engineer a reversal through manipulation or pressure. My goal, when I examined it honestly, was simply to be seen, to be counted. To have the document that would outlast my mother reflect something that resembled the truth of what her 2 children had each brought to their lives. That's all. That's really all it was. I started by reviewing everything I was legally entitled to review as the other heir. In Louisiana, heirs have certain rights around estate documentation, not everything, but enough. I requested the appraisal on the land. I reviewed it carefully. I noted the date. Then I looked into the land itself. This is the part I keep coming back to, the part that still does something to me when I sit with it. I keep coming back to it. The 8 acres were raw land, undeveloped, outside the city. My grandmother had bought them in the early 1960s, before that part of the parish had developed the way it eventually did. For most of my lifetime, they had been worth, not nothing, but not enormous. Agricultural assessment, modest value. The kind of asset that sits in an estate and earns nothing and costs a small amount annually in taxes. In the 18 months before my mother changed her will, the surrounding area had been rezoned for mixed commercial and residential development. 3 parcels adjacent to the 8 acres had sold to a development company. The appraisal that had come in at $340,000 was current, but the trajectory was not flat. I called a contact of mine, a commercial real estate attorney named Philip Arsenault, who had been a client of my firm for 6 years and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of development patterns in the parish. I asked him, without explaining why, what he thought the 8 acres were worth in a competitive sale given the current rezoning. He was quiet for a moment. "Lorraine," he said, "if someone put that parcel to market right now, with what's happening in that corridor, I'd say somewhere between $650 and $720. Maybe higher if there's a bidding situation." I wrote down $680,000 as a midpoint. I sat with that number for a week. Then I called my mother, not to confront her, not to accuse her. I called her on a Sunday, like I always did, and I talked to her for 40 minutes about normal things, her knee, my tomatoes. A neighbor of hers who was having a dispute with the HOA about a fence, and at the end I said, as naturally as I could manage, "Mom, I've been thinking about the land. Grandma's land, have you thought about what you want to do with it long-term?" A pause. Raymond's going to use it, she said, for the business. He has ideas about expansion. What kind of expansion? He wants to build a yard, equipment storage, maybe a small office. I thought about this. Raymond's landscaping business. 7 employees now, solid regional client base. The kind of business that could genuinely benefit from owned infrastructure rather than leased. Has he had it assessed for commercial development potential? I asked. I don't know. Why? Because the area's been rezoned, I said. I had someone look at it. The land is worth significantly more than the appraisal you have on file. Silence. What do you mean, significantly more? I told her the number. The silence that followed that number was a different kind of silence than the one before it. It had weight and shape. It was the silence of someone recalculating. How do you know this? She asked. Mom, I said as gently as I knew how. I do estate work. This is what I do. I waited. I didn't know, she said, finally, quietly. I know you didn't. Another long pause. Raymond doesn't know either, she said, and I could hear something in her voice, not guilt exactly, but its first cousin, the awareness of a mistake taking shape. I know he doesn't, I said. Mom, I'm not calling to cause a problem. I'm calling because you changed the will without telling me, and because the asset you changed it around is worth a lot more than anyone realized. And because I think you should have all the information. She was quiet for a very long time. I should have talked to you, she said. Yes, I said, you should have. That was the hardest thing I have ever said to my mother. Not because it was angry. It wasn't angry. I had worked very hard to drain the anger out of it before I made that call. But because it was true, plainly and without softening, and I had spent 30 years softening true things in conversations with her, because the alternative felt too costly. It didn't feel too costly anymore. My mother changed the will back 3 weeks later. She called me on a Sunday, earlier than usual, before I'd had my coffee, and said she had been to see the lawyer and the land was going back to equal split. I should have talked to you first, she said again. About the appraisal and about all of it, I should have talked to you. Yes, I said. But I'm glad you talked to me now. Raymond was, she stopped. He wasn't happy. I know, I said. I'm sorry it caused difficulty. And here's the thing, and this is the thing I want to sit with for a moment, because it matters, I was sorry. Not sorry I had made the call, not sorry the will had been changed. Sorry that the situation had required what it required. Sorry that 30 years of quiet and distance had made a correction necessary. Sorry that my mother had loved 2 children unequally for so long that she'd had to be shown a spreadsheet to understand the full cost of what she'd done. That is a genuinely sad thing. I don't feel triumphant about it, I feel resolved, which is different. Raymond called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next morning. I picked up the second time. He was not warm. He was controlled, Raymond at his most careful. Which meant he had decided exactly what he wanted to say before he said it, and was delivering it at a measured pace that was designed to suggest reasonableness while communicating displeasure. Mom told me about your conversation, he said. Okay, I said. I want you to know that I wasn't trying to take anything from you. I thought about that. About what it means to receive something you didn't earn at the expense of someone you didn't ask, and whether intending no harm is the same as causing no harm. I know you weren't, I said. I don't think you asked for it. Then why? Because it wasn't right, Raymond. Still calm, still even. It wasn't equal and it wasn't right, and I am done pretending I don't see that. A long pause. It's just land, he said. It's $680,000 worth of land, I said, but that's not actually the point. He was quiet. The point, I said, and I had thought about this, I had thought about whether to say it. And I had decided that this was the conversation, and if I didn't say it here, I would not say it anywhere. Is that you have been the favorite your whole life, and I have watched it and accepted it and worked around it. And I am not asking you to feel guilty about something you didn't choose. But I am asking you to understand that I exist, that what I've built exists, that I am in this family too. The line was very quiet. Lorraine, he said, and then nothing else for a moment. And then I know, that was it, 2 words, but they came out differently than I expected, not defensive, not calculating, just honest, tired. like he had known for a long time and hadn't known what to do with the knowing. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest conversation we had ever had. The land appraised at $710,000 the following year, when a development company made an unsolicited offer on the full corridor. My mother, on the advice of Philip Arsenault, whom I had connected her with, declined the offer and held. The following year, the same company came back at $890,000. She called me before she made any decision. That was new. That was, I don't have the right word for it. Different, the calling me first. We talked through the offer together. I walked her through the tax implications, the timing, the comparison between selling now and holding for further appreciation versus the carrying costs. She listened. She asked good questions. At the end she said, "What would you do?" And I told her, and she did it. We still don't have the easiest relationship. I want to be honest about that. The long patterns don't reverse in a single phone call or even a series of them. My mother still lights up differently for Raymond in a way that I notice, and have stopped pretending I don't notice. But I notice it now from a different position, not from a place of wanting to be seen by her in the way she sees him, but from a place of already knowing what I am and what I've built and not needing the room to light up differently to confirm it. That is a genuinely different place to stand. My house on the tree-lined street has a garden now. Real beds, properly planned, with a structure I designed over one winter and installed the following spring. Tomatoes in the back, they grow every year now, reliably, the way things grow once you've figured out the right conditions. A border of lavender along the front walk that my neighbor, an older man named George who has been here 23 years, told me flatly would not survive a Louisiana summer. It's on its third summer. Third year, they grow. Raymond and I have a different relationship than we used to. Not close, I don't know that we'll be close in the way some siblings are close, easy and habitual, and in and out of each other's houses, but honest. There is something between us now that is honest in a way it wasn't before, and I find I prefer the honest version of the distance to the dishonest version of the closeness. His business is doing well. He got a commercial loan and built a proper equipment yard on leased land outside the city. He hired an office manager. He sends me a text on my birthday. Now that is a real text, not an obligatory one. I can tell the difference. Last year, he sent a photo of his crew at a job site with a caption that said, 7 employees became 12. I wrote back congratulations, and I meant it entirely. My mother and I talk on Sundays. The calls are longer now than they used to be. She asks about work, about the house, about the garden. She tells me about Raymond, and I tell her I'm glad to hear it. It is imperfect and still slightly careful, and nothing like the relationship I might have wished for, and something I have decided to be grateful for anyway. Because gratitude for imperfect things is one of the skills you develop when you spend 30 years working with what you have. I am 43 years old. I am a partner in a firm I am proud of. I own a house I saved for in the years nobody was watching. I have a garden that grows. I have Bet, who still has that laugh, and Nora, who is still formidable, and a handful of other people who have seen me clearly and stayed. I have, somewhere interior, put down the weight of needing my mother to see me the way she saw Raymond. That weight, I carried it for so long it became part of how I walked, part of my posture, part of the way I moved through rooms. Putting it down didn't happen all at once. It happened the way that kind of weight gets put down, in small increments over years. In the privacy of driveways and kitchen windows and early morning hours, when you're honest with yourself about what you can change and what you have to find a way to carry differently. I want to say something to you that I don't know how to say without it sounding like a fortune cookie. But I'm going to try anyway because it's true, and the true thing deserves to be said, even when the language for it is imperfect. The love that asks you to disappear into it is not the love that will build you. The love that builds you is quieter. It comes from the people who sit across from you at kitchen tables and ask what you're reading. It comes from the colleagues who tell you the partnership is yours. It comes from the friends who stay. It comes from the Tuesday afternoon you finally say the true thing out loud to someone who needed to hear it, and they say, I know. and the room gets a little more honest than it was before. And sometimes it comes from yourself. From the 11 years of 15%, and the tomatoes that finally grew, and the pens still warm in your hand on the best day you ever had for yourself. I didn't need the land to know who I was. But I needed to claim it. There's a difference. It took me 39 years to understand the difference, and I'm still learning the edges of it, and that's okay. That's how understanding actually works, not as a sudden arrival, but as a thing you keep returning to, turning it a little each time, finding new angles in the light. The porch faces west. I sit on it in the evenings when the work is done, and the day is settling, and the light goes orange across the yard. My father would have liked this porch. I think about that sometimes. I think it's okay to think about it.